We do definitely lean more towards helping organizations just bring together their compliance program in a way that makes it affordable and repeatable.
You must have gathered some really important information and data to be able to build these processes and systemize things.
We always want to make sure that we start the discussion with a non-disclosure agreement, right? I look at compliance as a destination and security is more of a journey.
What are the most critical mistakes you see organizations making when it comes to data governance?
Cybersecurity is about protecting different types of data that have different values in the marketplace, both for good and for maybe not so good reasons.
Welcome to the podcast From Cold to Close. My name is Saeed and I'm the founder here at SRC Growth Partner, a growth company that works with professional services firms from around the world to help them increase their revenue and profitability by acquiring new clients. My guest today is John Danahey, the founder of Digital Tech Partners, an IT consulting firm specializing in governance, risk, and compliance. With over 30 years of hands-on experience spanning software development, infrastructure management, and cybersecurity, John has worked with everyone from Fortune 500 companies to government organizations, including a deployment to Iraq and 7 years leading IT operations for 8,000 employee at MITRE Corporation. John, pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. But in terms of actually letting the viewers and listeners know who John Danahey actually is, are you able to share from the horse's mouth, I guess, a little bit more about your background and what you do currently at your organization?
Sure. So, I went through business school when I was younger and I somehow found my way into IT. And that, I guess, was something that was supposed to happen, I guess, for my career, because my first job out of college with a marketing degree wasn't such a pleasant experience. I started out in sales and realized that that just wasn't for me. And I ended up at a marketing services firm, which was kind of a connection to my degree program. But I ended up working my way up and through the ranks and ended up being the director of IT for that organization after being there for about 6 years or so. And to tell you the truth, I haven't looked back since. So I've been in IT now for going on 30 years, as you had mentioned, and have done and seen a lot of things. But one of the common threads throughout my career has been the number of compliance requirements that I've had to be involved in, both from a project management perspective as well as from a technical perspective. So I was involved in ISO 9000 back at that marketing services firm. We had some quality problems that needed to be resolved, and we brought in an external consulting firm that taught us ISO 9000. And it's just been one compliance program after another. Most recently, it's been this thing called CMMC here in the United States, where we've got the cybersecurity maturity model certification program for Department of Defense contractors. So the Department of Defense wants to protect unclassified information that is relevant to weapons systems and things of that nature. So we're not dealing with the classified side of the fence, but we're certainly trying to protect a certain type of data, which is controlled unclassified information. And that kind of takes me back to when I was at MITRE. I was involved in a project or program to stand up compliance with DFARS. And DFARS was really defined as, implementing the NIST special publication 800-171 controls. So there's like 110 control objectives, or rather 110 controls with 320 control objectives. And that's one of our specializations. But that's not the only specialization. We do a lot of work with regard to HIPAA here, another US-based health information standard. So we're not a one-trick pony by any means, but we do definitely lean more towards helping organizations just bring together their compliance program in a way that makes it affordable and repeatable. And that, I think, is one of the real keys to success, is having repeatable processes, right? So if you've got a repeatable process, you can identify where variances occur and you can take the appropriate action to resolve those issues. From some of the certifications I've had in my career, like configuration management, you always want to have lightweight, repeatable processes that provide feedback loops. So when something is out of variance or something that exceeds a variance that's expected, you want to take a look at it, figure out what went wrong, and then feed that back into the process to enable continuous improvement. I think that's certainly an elusive statement that we hear a lot. But I think if you have a well-defined process, it makes it a lot easier to troubleshoot and improve upon.
You nailed it right there. And I think it's really interesting you talk about process as well. Obviously, your background in firstly coming into IT, spending over 30 years in the IT, and also your background in MITRE Corporation and working in the compliance side of things throughout your career, you must have gathered some really important information and data to be able to build these processes and systems and systemize things. Talk to me more about how your approach at Digital Tech Partners is when you take on a client and how you implement these processes.
Sure. So we always want to make sure that we start the discussion with a non-disclosure agreement, right? So before we can kind of dive into the weeds, and let's face it, for what it is that we do, what we excel at is identifying things that need to get fixed. And certainly we want to have our customers, our clients have the confidence that we're not going to kiss and tell, right? So we don't want to tell any tales. We certainly don't want to be speaking out of turn. And we want to make sure that we protect the conversation between the organizations, because some of what we uncover really shouldn't go anywhere further than the conversation between us and our clients. So it always starts out with a non-disclosure agreement. From the non-disclosure agreement, we move into a proposal. So we want to get into kind of the weeds with them in that first discovery conversation and find out what's important to the organization. Are they looking strictly for a compliance program? Or are they looking to get better with regard to security? Because the two of those things, they're really not compatible with each other. I would say that compliance is more of a building block towards security, but it's not. I look at compliance as a destination and security is more of a journey, if I had to kind of sum that up. And so we take a look at what is the culture of the organization. Is it a very top-down organization, or is it more participative as far as the management style goes? How are employees trained in the organization? Are they aware of the things that they're stewards of? So, that kind of gets us moving in the right direction, where we can present a proposal that addresses their priorities, addresses their needs, and gives us the ability to kind of gain that insight as to what they're really trying to accomplish. And then, beyond that, sometimes some minor negotiations, we get to a place where the number meets the client's needs as well as the program and the direction that we're trying to take, and kind of kick it off. From there, we'll do an assessment. And depending on what the objective is by the client, right? So in the GRC space, we always want to understand what's the risk appetite or the tolerance for the organization to accept things that maybe not so significant. Maybe there are minor variances that can be addressed with either policy or procedure, or whether they're really looking to kind of bring all of their activities up under one kind of management purview. And in that case, depending on what they're looking for, we'll do an assessment based on the criteria that's most relevant to them, right? We can do a National Institute of Standards and Technologies kind of basic cybersecurity assessment to figure out between people, process, and technology, where are they with regard to the maturity of the organization, being able to address cybersecurity as a function of the business. And from there, we kind of prioritize what those elements are of their program, and we identify the things that are strengths and weaknesses. We could come back and throw 300 items on the table, and if nobody knows where to start, you really don't get to where you want to be. So we'll help prioritize that, but we kind of align that with their objectives and their priorities and their risk tolerance. And we front end load the remediation recommendations are always front end loaded with the most important things need to be addressed up front, right? So we will always kind of give them, based on the level of risk associated with the variance, a roadmap for how they get from where they are today to where they need to be within the realm of compliance. But again, cybersecurity and compliance, they kind of go hand in hand. So depending on what they're looking to do, we can bring them on board. We have an automation tool that gives us the ability to do more than just one assessment with a client. That tool set gives us also the ability to distribute the workload across a wide range. So if the client's like a mid-market client and they've got 1,000 employees, the chances are they have several folks in IT. So, we can kind of do the division of labor and make sure that we engage the right people at the right time. And we can do that through automation, right? So one of the other benefits is that if we've already gone through an assessment, like with the NIST cybersecurity framework, we don't need to go asking the same questions over and over again, depending on what the next compliance effort is, right? So if there's a significant overlap between the NIST cybersecurity framework and, say, HIPAA, all of those assessments that are associated with the cybersecurity framework would be inherited by us in that next assessment into the HIPAA evaluation or assessment. So we're not browbeating people and asking them the same questions over and over and over again. So that's one way that we can do a couple of things there. One is we can create some efficiencies around, getting the work done faster. And then there's also the ability to save the client some money because let's face it, if we've got, coverage of 30% of the control set that's been inherited from one to the other, now we only have about a 70% assessment that's left to do rather than 100%, right? And again, it goes back to how many times do you want to bring your client to the table and ask them the same questions? It gets a little frustrating, I'm sure, on both sides of the conversation. So that's another area that we try to take some reasonable approaches to saving people some time and some.
Sure. It makes a lot of sense. But one of the things you touched on there, which I thought I'd raise, is you mentioned that cybersecurity and compliance are almost hand in hand. And obviously, you mentioned that compliance is the destination, cybersecurity is the journey, right? To all those out there who might not know what exactly cybersecurity looks like for a typical organization, what are the makings of what needs to be done when you're implementing cybersecurity?
Sure. So I think when it's funny that you asked this question because I had this question asked of me, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, and I kind of stumbled and fumbled a little bit, right? So what does cybersecurity mean? And I guess after having thought about this a little bit more, we want to make sure that we make things very easy for folks to understand, right? So, and it's not a matter of talking down to anybody. We all have our specializations, right? I mean, so I would say that for my approach to that question, I would suggest that cybersecurity is about protecting different types of data that have different values in the marketplace, both for good and for maybe not so good reasons. And what are those prescribed methods of protecting that type of data? And then how do we make sure that when we're evaluating an organization's effectiveness at protecting that we kind of dig into the weeds here? It will get into the point where we've had HIPAA audits that we've done for folks, and I will personally go to a file cabinet that I know contains health information, and I'll see if that file cabinet is locked or if someone knows where the key is or who the key master is for that particular office or whatnot. So, and then interviewing staff too, as I mentioned earlier, asking pointed questions of the people that are actually doing the work will help us understand just how effective the training program is, for instance, right? So a lot of these compliance efforts that we are engaged in will have a requirement for there to be a training program. And in order to validate that the training program is effective, we need to talk to the people that do the work. And it's not just a matter of how many phishing emails did you receive and respond to it. It's more of do you understand the different types of data that you process? And do you understand how to protect it within the realm of your workspace? And, you can keep expanding that out in wider circles as far as the organization goes. You start with the person, then you look at the systems, and then you look at the policies and procedures. And you want to be able to draw the picture that says, here's the regulation. This is what the reg says that you need to be doing. Here's what you're doing, and here are the variances so that we can kind of button that up so that in the event that something were to happen, that there's a defensible position for the organization, right? So at the end of the day, the compliance cause problems if you're out of compliance. Security will always cause a problem if you're insecure, but they do kind of go hand in hand in that regard.
Sure. And it's a really interesting point, that especially you talk about data, right? And data is very much something that is being more widely understood in today's day in more on a regular basis. So everywhere we look, data is everywhere. Everyone's worried about what the big companies are doing, whether there's data breaches, whether it's social media, whatever it might be. Everyone is more concerned about what's happening with their own data and organizational data. What are the most critical mistakes you see organizations making when it comes to data governance?
That's a loaded question. So I would say that more frequently than not, there's a level of trust that is being extended to folks. And it's not that the trust is misplaced, it's that there could be so many different layers of misunderstanding, I think, that make it really challenging, right? So I can't tell you how many times I've run across folks that are very, very bright, right? Brilliant people working in IT that have the skills that are required to do a good job. And there's also that kind of when you're a really smart person, you give yourself a lot of latitude, and sometimes you don't see the mistakes that you make. So one of the things that I always try to encourage folks to do is to have peer review, right? So just, get a second opinion. Am I right in pursuing this way? But I've seen a lot of IT people that just make assumptions that because they're really smart, they know their job, they will look at a standard and say, yes, I'm doing that, but not necessarily always understanding what the intent of that particular control is. And I think that that's where not so much the hubris, not so much the ego, but sometimes it's the not understanding the intent of what the control is saying or how it's implemented can get you into trouble. And then depending on the size of the organization, the higher up in the organization you go, a lot of the messaging gets filtered, right? So senior managers don't want to hear about every single detail associated with the compliance program. They want to know on a scoring basis, how am I doing? Am I above 80%? Am I below 70%? Where do I need to make changes? Are there investments that need to be made? So I think that when we look at one of the other contributing factors here too, is that a lot of the engineering degree programs, when you get into IT, you are usually moving in a particular direction, right? You're a network engineer, you're an operating systems engineer, you're a programmer, you could be a storage administrator, whatever that role is that you kind of matriculate into, sometimes will cloud your ability to see the bigger picture also because you're very specialized in a particular area. And understanding what's to the left and what's to the right of you in IT is very important. And when it comes to cybersecurity, the interfaces between people, the interfaces between systems, the interfaces between processes should be where we spend more of our time and attention, because those are generally the places where things will fall apart, whether it's a lack of communication or a misunderstanding, or as I mentioned, I'm really bright. I see the controls. I understand what I should be doing with my particular area, maybe, or I'm going to make some assumptions. And sometimes those assumptions are wrong. Yeah. And, so I don't know that there's no such thing as a, kind of a widespread conspiracy when it comes to people making mistakes in IT. It's more, everyone does, I think, really want to do a good job. But again, I think within the construct of most IT organizations, you've got the lights on responsibility. So you have to keep the production systems running. You have to deal with problems as they arise. And something like patching systems or something like reading a report or identifying a variance sometimes gets deprioritized, right? So I think it's a combination of a lot of different factors. But really, I think that we've certainly had a lot of challenges over the years where, especially nowadays with IoT and all of the other technologies that we're starting to see, emerging here, the amount of data that we create is significant, and being able to get the noise out of the environment is really challenging, I think. But analytics, I think that, artificial intelligence, I know that's being used a lot lately, but traditional machine learning and things of that nature make the job, I think, a little bit easier. It's just a matter of making sure that the design meets the needs. And sometimes I think we start down a path before we understand what the requirement is. And I think that's another area where we have some weaknesses.
I think you've raised some really great points there. And I think that's something you see in many facets of business, in many specializations, especially internally in an organization, where you can sometimes feel like you're in your own echo chamber, where you can only see what is going on around you. And sometimes having an objective eye, an objective process coming in, looking at what's going on, clearly being able to identify where the bottlenecks are, where the issues are, but also seeing it work out in play with multiple other organizations doing the same similar things. So having almost a scaffolding of information that you can go in and go, okay, well, no, I've seen this before. This is how we have to rectify it. And then being able to communicate that to the individuals that you're working with within the organization, right? You obviously work with IT staff, technical managers, CIOs, CTOs, and C-suite executives within an organization when you do start a partnership or an engagement, and they may not have necessarily the level of technical skills in the detail that you might have. How do you communicate the complex technical risks and recommendations to leaders who need to make strategic decisions?
So we always want to try to frame it with the risk, right? So if we can articulate what the challenge is and, kind of explain what it would take from a sequence of events kind of perspective, and then what the associated risk is with a variance or with a deficiency, to make sure that they understand clearly that, again, trying to get the noise out of the equation. Not everything that we find is going to rise to the level that needs to be addressed immediately. But for those things that do rise to that level, we want to make sure that it's very clear to the managers that this needs to be addressed for very specific reasons. And if it's a compliance thing, we want to make sure that we articulate that. I think it's a lot easier to make the statement of why an investment or a change is required based on a compliance effort than it is for security purposes, right? So again, we got that journey versus the destination, and it's so easy, I think, to confuse the two. And sometimes, if an organization is only seeking that compliance effort, they'll lose the big picture with security. But I think that in our world, it's a lot easier to motivate folks when they see that it's a compliance problem. And you brought up a good point, which is when we are working with our clients, we're really there as a partner. We want to partner with the organization that's looking for the help. We want to do that objective third party kind of assessment. I think our best clients are the ones that understand that there are these limitations with regard to IT. There is a very busy and a very stressful kind of work environment for the folks that are doing the hands-on work, and bringing someone in from the outside that is genuinely interested in helping people get better at doing what it is that they do right now. But the only way that we can do that is by understanding and assessing the current state, and then having that kind of strategic conversation around where do we want to be, right? So if we're only looking for compliance, I think that makes it an easy conversation. But if we're looking to improve security, now we have to start thinking about mindset. We have to start thinking about behavior of people. We have to start making sure that people can internalize what their actions mean to the organization and to themselves as they're the stewards for this kind of data. So yeah, I think that the third party looking over the shoulder, coming up with an objective assessment where there isn't a horse in the race. We're going to come in and kind of partner with the IT organization because let's face it, there's a lot of folks that get nervous when people come in from the outside too, right? So we always want to make sure that for us, for the best fit, we're looking for organizations that have that leadership mindset that continuous improvement is something that can be achieved. And the only way that continuous improvement can be achieved is through the people who are working in the organization. And if it's a supportive kind of environment like that, the sky is really the limit. We can come in and have a very positive impact because everyone has a chance to at least express opinions and come up with alternative solutions, because I'm not going to be the guy that says you have to do it this way. There's a spectrum of things that could be done within the realm of compliance or security that aren't necessarily technical. Some of it could be procedural, some of it could be training, some of it could be technical. And we don't want to go in with the assumption that we have a technical solution to a problem that hasn't been defined yet.
Fantastic. I think you raised some really interesting points there. This segment of the podcast we like to call the Entrepreneur's Room. And we ask a series of questions to our guests to give our viewers and listeners an opportunity to understand how business owners and business leaders think and operate within their business. So the first question I'd like to ask every guest at this stage of the podcast is, how are you currently spending your days as a leader of the business?
So as a smaller business, right, with aspirations, there's the ever-present need for business development. So that's a piece of the day. There is a significant piece of the day that is dedicated towards delivery because as an SME, it requires hands-on work. We're constantly evaluating contracts and SOC 2 reports. And with the changes in the technical arena around cloud computing and all of the changes that has brought about, we don't see a lot of internal hosting of data centers and things of that nature anymore. Most people are outsourcing. And as they outsource, their risks are changing. And that dynamic becomes something that the organization has to come to terms with, because if you are heavily reliant upon a software as a service capability for your organization, and that is no longer available to you for whatever reason, how do you maintain operations? And those challenges are dramatic now, right? So we get into what are your recovery time objectives and things of that nature. And I think it has become even more difficult to kind of predict what some of your next steps would be in the event that something catastrophic happens, right? So, and we have seen a number of the large or hosting providers, or I'm not going to name any names, but we've seen outages that have lasted more than reasonable amounts of time. And we, I think, as a consumer of these technologies, have to come to terms with what do you do when it's not there? And that could be something as simple as, I hate to use this as an example, but if someone were to strike a telephone pole and your only access to the internet, is being delivered through that telephone pole, if a wire or a cable is severed, what do you do? And I can't tell you how many times in my career I've had the experience of a construction activity happening somewhere within someone's reasonable proximity, a backhoe operator severing fiber optic cables. I've seen that. I've seen situations where an electric outage or electric service outage or SAG has caused generators to fire up. And when the generator fires up and tries to power up the data center in anticipation and to hopefully avoid an outage, I've seen things like cables get burned underground or fuses pop and not having backups and spares and things of that nature. So there's a ton of analysis that really needs to be done to understand where are my risks and are they being addressed in a reasonable fashion.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense in making your day to day. I can imagine it being full of different challenges, dealing with different.
There's no boring days, right?
Yeah, I can imagine.
Absolutely no boring days.
For sure, for sure. Obviously, running a business is a challenge, especially a small business. There's a lot of things that you need to be on top of, you need to be managing as well. What are the most important metrics to you in running the business?
Certainly cash flow is one of them, right? So cash flow, pipeline, right? So if I had to name the two most important aspects, I would say cash flow and pipeline. So we always want to make sure that we've got a little bit of depth in the pipeline. I always want to kind of sell beyond the capability that I currently have. I've been fortunate enough in my career to work with a lot of really good professionals. And just as a simple example, I had a gentleman that I hired about 30 years ago on my first job at that marketing services firm. He reached out to me several months ago, and he's gone off on his own in a very similar path to what we're doing. So being able to kind of work together with him in a partnership kind of arrangement has given us the ability to kind of fill in for spikes when it comes to demand. And we've got very similar backgrounds. He made his way to the top of the ladder at the company that I hired him into. And I've kind of meandered through my career. And here we are, 30 years later, working together, doing some good work for our clients. So the third priority is definitely being able to deliver the right level of skill and the quality that's expected for the type of work that we do. And I'm very selective about who we work with and who we hire because, of course, our reputation needs to be the fourth most important, I think, in line. So I guess cash flow, pipeline, staffing, and reputation are all like right on the top of my list.
I love it. I love it. And I love the fact that you say cash flow and pipelines. Whenever I hear someone say revenue, I always think to myself, it's too cosmetic. And that is that saying of revenue is vanity, profitability is sanity, right? It makes me think, whereas if you're thinking cash flow, you're thinking, okay, no, how do I manage the business and how is it? And pipeline is forecasting for future success of the business, right? So it gives me a lot of insight into the type of entrepreneur that I'm speaking with and the type of mind as well. So it's really interesting to hear that, as well as, of course, staffing and ensuring, I guess, if you do great work, you're more likely to get more work, right? And referred and word. So, of course, that's another factor and a pillar to be able to ensure success. And then reputation, that makes a lot of sense in the sense that a bad reputation will lose you opportunities. A good reputation will bring in the opportunity. So I think that some really interesting points there. How are you currently growing the business? And you touched on business development earlier and doing business development activities. What are you currently doing as business development activities? How are you currently growing the business? Yeah.
So, kind of one of the benefits to what it is that we do in that GRC space, the governance, risk, and compliance space, is that we'll identify opportunities for improvements within our client base. Right? The situation is rare where, someone will reach out to us and say, we need you to fix our entire IT department, right? So that's not going to happen in the real world. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're using our assessment as an opportunity also to sell within our clients, right? So if there are weaknesses within a particular technology stack, or if there's a weakness, when we hear somebody complaining about something, that's usually something that we want to take note of and explore a little bit, right? So if there's a pain point here, we want to know where those pain points are. We want to understand the context of the problem or the context of the pain, right? So every problem has a context. And this kind of goes back to the systems engineering background that I had from MITRE, and every problem has a context. And unless you understand the context of the problem, you're going to run at a higher level of probability of failure of addressing the right problem if you haven't defined it properly. And that's a function of, vetting it with all of the stakeholders, et cetera. But so twofold. One is if it is a pain point and it's a technical pain point, we have kind of grown into a model here where we don't necessarily have to be the technical provider to solve the problem. We just need to understand the context and the problem. And we have partnerships with a few of the technical services distributors here in the United States. And so with the larger clients that we have, I wouldn't be able to staff quickly enough. If it was a network engineering thing, or if it was a systems administration thing, well, maybe systems admin is a bad example, because I think I can scale my folks in that specific area. But I think that when we start getting into some very high level of expertise and very low level of technical depth, right? Those are the areas that we want to have some really solid, vetted, national presence kind of providers where we know failure isn't an option, or failure is not something that's going to be a factor in the decision-making process. So that's where we have the ability to kind of take a look at the landscape. Who are the providers in this space? How do they stack up against each other? And with my background, I know the questions to ask, and I'll pull in the solution architects from the TSDs and we'll kind of say, look, here's the problem. Who are the better providers in your network that can address this issue? And then let's go have a conversation with them.
Absolutely. John, it's been a really interesting conversation today. I like to end every single podcast with the same question, and that is, if you had a magic wand you could wave to solve one business problem, what would that be?
So I would say, because I definitely tend to lean more towards the engineering side of the fence, I would say having a dedicated business development activity that can help us grow the business without necessarily me making all of the mistakes I do when trying to sell to folks, right? Because that's just not who I am. But I would say that business development is probably the biggest thing that I am focusing in on right now. And we're taking measures to address that. We do have a couple of folks that are, kind of like hired guns that are looking for opportunities for us. So it's kind of the same model, right? So we've got some folks that look to place opportunities with us, through us, to the TSDs and the providers there also. So I'm hopeful that my responsibilities in at least the prospecting realm will subside a bit and get more into solution engineering, which is really where my forte is. So yeah, I hope I answered that.
Yeah.
I know I didn't do it succinctly, but it was
No, it's
a little
really,
bit of an
it's definitely a problem that a lot of business owners face, in the sense that prospecting is very frustrating. Business development in general, and B2B specifically, is quite a tough problem to solve. And so that's why I've heard it many times before, and you've articulated it very well, in the sense that if everyone could get more business all the time, business would be easy, wouldn't it? And then that's the reality of it. And so, yeah, no, 100%. Well, John, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. You've been a great guest, and thank you so much for sharing your insights today. For all the viewers and listeners out there that might want to reach out to you, speak to you, how would they reach out to you? How would they find you?
So our website is www.dtpcyber.com. So we've shortened down the URL a bit because as my fingers are getting older and older, it's more cumbersome to type out Digital Tech Partners. Yes, so Digital Tech Partners or dtpcyber.com. And I can always be reached at jdanahey@digitaltechpartners.com.
Fantastic.
Yeah, we're looking forward to helping more good people solve hard problems.
Fantastic. Well, John, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for sharing your time today.
Thank you.